Hi everyone, we are going to cover a couple key things from Unit 8 on aquatic pollution with today's lecture. So let's go ahead and start off with a definition of aquatic or water pollution. Basically, water pollution is going to be any form of contamination that makes its way into a waterway. So a stream, a river, ocean, lakes, or even groundwater. Remember we talked about previously in the year that groundwater can be affected by water percolating from the surface down into it. So that can carry toxins along with it and be problematic for the health of aquifers, which quite a few areas rely on for their water source for drinking. And water pollution can affect both aquatic and terrestrial or land-based organisms. It's not just fish that are harmed by this, although primarily we focus on the aquatic plants and the fish in the water. Ultimately, though, as you work your way up your food chain, if there is pollution in the water that's affecting organisms that are lower on the food chain and there are land animals eating them, that can cause an effect on those land animals as well. We'll see that when we look at mercury in just a minute. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at how water pollution is categorized. There are two different types of water pollution that we typically focus on: point sources and non-point sources. So we're going to start here with point sources. Point sources of water pollution occur when we can see exactly where the pollution is coming from. So basically, pollutants emitted directly into a body of water. Oftentimes this is from an outflow or discharge pipe at an industrial facility, and we can see that pipe releasing water directly into the environment. So if we take a look at our pictures over here, notice we see the pollution coming right out of the pipe. Same thing with the one on the right, the pollution is pouring out of the pipe directly. We can see exactly where it's coming from. Our other type of water pollution is a non-point source type of pollution, and with these the pollution is going to be more diffuse or more spread out in a location, and it makes it very difficult to actually identify directly what the source is. So there's no pipe there that says, hey, pollution is coming out of here into this waterway. So with non-point source solution, we often have runoff affecting the health of the waterway nearby. So for example, in this picture of a field at the top, we can see all of this water, but what's happening is it's running off of the surface and kind of all collecting together. And let's say that here's like our waterway down here. We don't know for sure where all of this pollution came from. We know it came from somewhere back here where I just drew X's, but we don't have a pipe that's literally directing us right to it saying, hey, it's coming out of here. So this often could be fertilizers that are collecting on a farm field, and then when it rains, the runoff is going to collect them and move them toward whatever waterway is nearby. It could be from, as we can see in this bottom picture, from cows. So let's say we've got, in this case, some cow pies. So there's cow poop all over this field, and these cow pies that are out here, when it rains, all the bacteria, anything else in them is all going to wash toward the waterway. So notice that they are kind of up on an incline, and rain runoff is going to carry the bacteria, for example, from that into that waterway down here. So it's more diffuse, it's more spread out. There may also be fertilizer in that field as well, and that can lead to issues such as eutrophication, which we're going to review in detail in just a minute. But if you remember from previous units, especially when we talked about farming, we talked about that the fertilizers we use in farming, such as nitrogen and phosphate-based chemicals, can lead to algae overgrowth. Nitrogen and phosphate are both limiting nutrients for plants, and algae in particular. And so when they get into a waterway, it encourages the growth of that algae. And what can happen is that algae eventually dies and it causes oxygen depletion issues. And we'll look at that in more detail in just a minute. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at some more specific point and non-point sources of pollution. Remember that point sources typically come right out of a pipe. You can see them pouring out. Whereas non-point sources, you can't really see. They're more diffuse, they're kind of more spread out. So take a look at our picture on the left of kind of our animated city or town area here. Pause the video for a minute and take a few seconds to try to identify as many point sources as you can. All right, let's see what we can identify. So we are looking for pipes. Notice that we have a pipe here. Okay, we have this pump actually is pulling water out of the aquifer, so this one is not going to count over here, so we'll say no for that one. We have a factory that has a pipe attached to it that's dumping water out here. Okay, we have actually an air pollution point source as well. We can see these smokestacks are putting pollution directly into the atmosphere. We know that's where it's coming from. So that would be an example of an air pollution point source. All right, now non-point sources are more diffuse. They're more spread out. So you have to get a little bit creative with this one. So go ahead and pause the video for a minute, and I want you to try to find as many non-point sources as you can, and then we'll go over them. All right, so if we look for our non-point sources, notice that we have our irrigation going on with this particular agricultural field. So this whole area right here, if this is also being fertilized and there's runoff, we could have that runoff making it to the waterway over here. We have these cows. Okay, their fecal bacteria or the bacteria from their poop could end up making its way into the nearby waterway. Notice that this cow is actually standing in the water. Okay, so if he's doing his business in the water, that is also going to help add more pollutant into that water. Okay, we could have runoff from these areas of forest back here. Let's say that this is a managed forest. Maybe they're having to add fertilizer or some other chemical to it. Maybe it's a pesticide. We could have that running off this incline into the waterway, and then it makes its way down through the water. If we have this home over here and the homeowner is fertilizing the water, that fertilizer can easily run off. And then one of the things that can be a little tricky is when we have areas like cities that have a lot of roadway in them. Roadways are impervious or impermeable surfaces, meaning water does not percolate down into the ground because it runs off all of this roadway we see all through here. So that can heavily contribute to non-point sources of pollution. So let's say that this entire city area, all the green area maybe is managed, fertilized by the city, and then you have all of this roadway and concrete around it. All of this will end up running off into waterways as well. This is also considered a non-point source of pollution. So impervious surfaces can be problematic. Farming can be problematic. Having homes where it's fertilized can be problematic, especially if you are over-fertilizing. And then having animals, their feces can also be an issue. And this is part of why it's very important that you end up picking up your dog poop, is because the bacteria in dog feces can actually wash away when it rains into the drainage systems close to your house, and that can contaminate nearby waterways with fecal coliform bacteria. So let's make a list of different types of water pollution. We've mentioned a few already. Air pollution can actually contribute to water pollution. We did talk previously in Unit 7 about mercury being released from the burning of fossil fuels and that making it into waterways. Chemicals and trash, microbes, I mentioned fecal coliform bacteria from dogs on the last slide, that can easily from any animal make it into waterways. Mercury, as we mentioned, related to air pollution, can be a bioaccumulation issue. Noise pollution even. So if you have like military vessels out in the water and they're using radar or sonar that's making noise, that can be very distracting and make it difficult for organisms that use their own form of echolocation to try to hunt or to talk to each other. Runoff and nutrients, so like our phosphorus and nitrogen-based fertilizers. Oxygen depleting substances, these are things that help literally remove oxygen from the water. We don't want that because fish rely on that oxygen to be able to breathe. Suspended particles can block sunlight, so if too much sediment gets washed into waterways due to runoff or erosion, then you're not going to have sunlight shining through the water and it's going to prevent plants from growing. And then also thermal sources of pollution. One of the thermal sources we previously mentioned was with the water that comes out of a nuclear facility. Remember that the nuclear plant itself has uranium that they use to heat up water. That generates power, but then that hot water is left. So they'll cool it, but the problem is they don't usually get it back to the external outside temperature of water. And so if we are releasing warm water back into the environment, oftentimes fish will just stay away from it. So let's recap a couple of ways that we can have air pollution affect water. We've talked about the fact that mercury comes from burning fossil fuels. So if we are burning coal at a coal-fired power plant, mercury is one of the byproducts of that can be problematic. So that gets into the atmosphere, it eventually settles out, often into nearby waterways. Well, mercury is known to bioaccumulate in organisms, and then that can biomagnify up the food chain. And because mercury is neurotoxic, it can be very dangerous to organisms with high levels of it in their system. Sulfur dioxide and nitric oxides from burning of coal as well. They can be emitted from that coal burning again, from cars. They can lead to acidification. So you can actually get acid deposition or acid rain occurring due to those. And then that can affect waterways by lowering the pH to a dangerous level that organisms cannot handle. or even ammonia, which is a source of nitrogen. And as we know, nitrogen, when it gets into waterways, can lead to eutrophication. So let's dig into mercury a little bit and talk about how that can cause a problem with biomagnification. So mercury is a naturally occurring element, but the contribution of humans by burning coal can be really problematic when we get high levels of it in the environment. So because it bioaccumulates within organisms, the organisms at the top of the food chain can very easily get too high of levels of mercury in them, and it can make it toxic. For example, if people were to go eat like albacore tuna, as we see with that gray fish on the left, or a halibut, and they have high levels of mercury in their system, that could be dangerous to our health. The other big problem is methyl mercury, and there are certain bacteria in the environment, particularly in water, that can convert that mercury released through the coal combustion into a more dangerous form, and it's known as methyl mercury. Well, that methyl mercury is very difficult for organisms to eliminate from their system. And so when they have that in their body, it doesn't go away as quickly, and so it bioaccumulates faster. And so they get a higher and higher concentration of mercury within their system. Another major way that humans can influence the health of nearby waterways is by the use of fertilizers. And we've talked previously in the year when we were discussing farming how overuse of fertilizers or too much runoff carrying too much fertilizer into nearby waterways can be problematic due to what we call cultural eutrophication, meaning it's caused by people. It's anthropogenic. So what happens is nitrates and phosphates, which are two chemicals used in fertilizers, get put onto like grass or a farm field, and then if it rains, a lot of that fertilizer that has not been absorbed by plants yet can get washed directly into waterways. Well, when those get into waterways, they cause that algae overgrowth, and we'll go through the steps that occur with that in just a minute as well. So phosphates are not water soluble, so one of their big problems is that they adhere to soil particles. If you have fertilizer and then erosion and those soils get washed into waterways, you end up with a lot of that fertilizer in the waterway, and then that leads to the algae overgrowth. Let's take a look at how that algae actually overgrows. Like, how does eutrophication actually occur? Well, when the nitrogen and phosphorus enter the waterway, so algae is going to increase because it's basically being fed by the nitrogen and phosphorus. Then as they increase, as you can see in the picture on the right, how bright green that water is, that's all algae floating on top. Notice that it's really opaque. The light is being blocked. So light's not going to be able to make it through that water column down to plants that might be rooted in the bottom of that river, stream, or lake. So if light cannot make it to those plants, they can't photosynthesize and they can die. The other big problem is algae in large quantities can also die off very quickly. They don't live very long. And then as they decompose, they're going to eat up oxygen in the water. So their actual decomposition process is going to lower the oxygen level, and that can lead to fish and plant die-offs because both plants and fish need oxygen for respiration. So one of the worst side effects that can occur from that eutrophication is the creation of dead zones. And dead zones are hypoxic or totally oxygen depleted regions that occur in water because of eutrophication and algae using up oxygen as it decays. So in the case of this dead zone that we are seeing in the Gulf of Mexico, and you see Louisiana right here, the Mississippi is actually carrying quite a bit of fertilizer down to the end of its watershed. So we have all of this fertilizer being washed in from both directions here. And then the Mississippi is just carrying all of this into the Gulf. And so that high concentration of fertilizer being washed in from areas, further north, from both sides of the river, all of that watershed is going to just be dumping into the Gulf of Mexico, carrying all of those fertilizers with it. So when the nitrogen and the phosphorus get down here in high quantities, it's going to encourage algae growth, and that algae growth is going to end up eating up the oxygen as that algae blooms and then decays and dies. All right, the last thing we need to touch on is a few other ways that water pollution and other types of pollution can affect the oceans. So there's two key things we should know. Carbon dioxide can be a huge problem. We know that carbon dioxide in high quantities in the atmosphere, usually through fossil fuel combustion, it is going to end up impacting oceans as well. And that is because carbon dioxide will dissolve into the ocean. So the ocean actually helps regulate the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The problem is the more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the more the ocean tends to take in. And as it takes in that carbon dioxide, the way that the ocean helps buffer that, it causes the ocean's pH to drop or become more acidic. Our big problem here is that that more acidic ocean is going to lead to coral reefs being damaged. And that is because the outer skeleton of plankton is actually a carbonate-based thing. It's an alkaline material. So when alkaline and acid reacts, it causes that outer skeleton to break down. Okay, our last thing for water pollution is a little bit on oil spills. Okay, we've seen them occur. They cause a lot of damage to the coastline. They can cause damage to the fishing industry. But the big problem here is that this oil often floats on the water, and so it's damage to organisms, let's say dolphins, turtles, seabirds, anything that is sitting near that water or is coming up for oxygen, so like a dolphin coming up to breathe, they can get coated in that oil, and so it can be ingested. It's difficult to clean off of them. So we see a large number of organism deaths due to oil spills. Our other big problem is trying to clean them up. So if you look at the bottom right picture, you can see that boat is dragging what's called a boom around trying to collect some of that oil. Then our seabird, if we look in the bottom left, you can see he's coated in oil. So birds naturally try to preen their feathers. So when they go through and try to clean out that oil out of their feathers, that is going to end up causing them to ingest it as well, and that is going to be a toxic material for them. All right, thank you so much for watching this overview of water pollution from Unit 8.